big welcome to everybody on this really amazing occasion. And I won't say very much at all, because to me, if I go to seminars, there's nothing more boring than long introductions when you've come to see somebody as extraordinary as Dr. Whitmont. I will just say that it's taken me about 3 years to actually convince him to come here to us. Every year I'd write about 3 letters saying, the mountains are beautiful, we'll put you in a wonderful place far away from the city. And anyway, finally, I'm really delighted that he's come. And like everything in life, of course, it seems to come at the right moment. You know, one pushes and pushes and says it has to happen now. And what I find is happening that's so extraordinary now, and I feel we're part of, is that things happen at just the right time. And it seems to me that we're living in an extraordinary time now, that everything is coming together. And this, on the brochure, it spoke of the alchemy, the marriage of homeopathy and psychotherapy. And I think it's a time when really all that needs to pull together, and on a quite another level of understanding. And of all the people that can communicate that and have really allowed that to happen, I think Dr. Whitmont is a real example of that.
Thank you. Now, let me say one thing. Tomorrow, it will not be dream analysis. I would like to show you how you can deal with dreams. And I'll today explain why I don't like this dream analysis, hacking it apart. But anyway, when I prepared this material, I caught myself at several points asking myself, so what? Why? What is? Am I really concerned with? What do I want to bring home in bringing together homeopathy, depth psychology, and alchemy? The title of this seminar could be Psychology and Alchemy and Homeopathy. And I have deliberately referred to the main opus of Carl Jung, who called this one volume Psychology and Alchemy. It happened that he missed out on homeopathy because of his personal, utterly orthodox medical training, which really made him, on the field of medicine, a thoroughly positivistic traditional thinker. I had raised personally that point with him and drawn his attention to the complementary function, whereupon he passed the buck and said, okay, go ahead, you do it. Now, why is it my concern? I believe that Hahnemann's discovery will in later days possibly, hopefully, be ranked equal with the discoveries of Copernicus and Einstein, because it is something of an importance that far exceeds practical therapeutics. In its implications, and particularly in complementation with Jung's, I might say, discovery of the reality of the psyche, Hahnemann's discovery amounts to nothing less but the discovery of the reality of the spirit as a function, as inherent in matter. And you can perhaps already now consider what radical change this concrete and demonstrable discovery could have for the whole existential, philosophical, and religious orientation of modern man. To get us over the point where we, on the one hand, we deal with a science that refuses to concern itself with basic meanings, and a religious tradition that has become totally irrelevant to where we really are in our recent development. So this is about what I'm aiming at, hopefully. Now, starting, however, with practical considerations. There are two cases, two people, both are sulfur types. And make it short, the one is a Wall Street broker who is in a profound depressive state, chronic depression. He has had sulfur, his symptoms are of sulfur, nothing happens emotionally to the depression. Also, to make it short, one of his first dreams was that he was on a lonely and deserted island, all waste and dry, no life, and completely isolated from anything important. Well, that tells a story. This is where he is in his life. But in the further course of the work, he brought a dream that there was a very beautiful woman to whom he hesitatingly approaches, and as he embraces her, everything changes. Colors, everything comes to life. Now, this woman happened to be a musician whom he greatly adored. And it was from this we came into a consideration whether it is not the soul of music that is really calling him. I'll make it short. He became a musician, and that fixed his depression. He was caught on the desert island of an activity of a life that was not for him. This incidentally shows you what one can do with dreams. I couldn't have figured out, I couldn't have told him, you ought to become a musician. But this new life outlook did what sulfur did not do. A reverse case, the daughter of a writer who had great aspirations of also being a writer and couldn't make it, also in a profound depression. We worked through that. She saw it, went elsewhere, but the depression remained. Sulfur lifted the depression. So what have you got here? Often the remedy will do it. At other times the remedy will not do it and will call for a change in life orientation. Often the life orientation will do it, will not do it, but it calls for the remedy in addition. Question is why? What's going on? How does one decide which is to go where and why? In other words, let me see, add a little bit more trouble before I go into that. There are several situations that we have encountered, some of I have, that do not quite fit our notions. One that is personal to me was accounted to me by Elizabeth Wright Hubbard, one of perhaps my most important teacher in homeopathy. She told me of a situation where she had a patient, and again, after the 5th or 6th or 7th or 9th or 10th prescription, nothing had happened. Now, Elizabeth was a very intuitive person and usually snapped it like that and usually hit it. This time she didn't, and she was impelled to sit down and work on the case. Which she did and came up with a remedy, and it was arsenicum, and it was a brilliant success. However, when the patient returned, she discovered to her horror that she had forgotten to give the remedy. But the patient was improved. I just questioned David on the trip here about something that he mentioned at another paper where a woman whose remedy seemed to be uric acid wrote it on a piece of paper and put it around her neck or somewhere, and it worked. I know of an instant where a person attended a seminar on crystals and focused on quartz and came down the next day with a vicious facial neuralgia with all the silica symptoms. which had to be antidoted by heparin. She hadn't taken any medicine, she hadn't eaten the quartz, she had meditated on the quartz and proved it. So I repeat the question, what's going on here? In other words, what is the relation then between psyche and soma? The answer to this is that the whole question is wrong, because it is a question of what's the difference between me and me. Here we are, our problem is that we are caught in the Cartesian post-Renaissance artificial split between what Descartes called the res cogitans, the thinking stuff, and the concrete stuff, in the res extensa, as it called it. There's an artificial mental separation of something that is a functional unit. The one being seen as invisible and non-substantial, and the other as substantial and visible in the space-time. Now, accepting temporarily this, which of these categories then applies to a homeopathic potency? Is it res cogitans or is it res extensa? Well, you can say it, of course, it's in a bottle, there are pills, there is liquid. But what about the phenomenon of grafting? What is grafting? Your bottle is empty, you refill it with sugar granules, give it a shake, and you have a medicine. Now, that sounds crazy. In my own use, I would say 75 of my medicines are grafts. And some of them go back to potencies that have been made 100 or 120 years ago, have been grafted at least 50 or 60 times, to say the least. And I have produced aggravations and provings with them. So there you go again. So what then is a potency? We have the grafting phenomenon, we have the induction effects of the grafting, and we have the, I might almost say, mental effects. After all, you know, there are, quote, potencies made, I understand, by writing the name of the medicine on a piece of paper and putting it into something with a magnet, I don't know, and doing something, and they have a potency. And I have been told I haven't used them, but I've been told they work just like ordinary remedies. I still prefer to go safe on that one. But what we then have here, the only way we can explain this or see it is in terms of information. That evidently, whatever we deal with transmits its, what is called now information, to the walls of the vial, to the pills, and to whatever. Or directly. But information presupposes mind. If I give you an information, you don't write it down into your forehead, but you perceive it in the terms of this peculiar entity which we call mind. I don't propose to know what that is. At the same time, information is that which informs, namely that puts something into form. In other words, it is knowledge, what we call knowledge of some kind, that creates some sort of a form. Now here we are reminded of the physicist Schrödinger's concept of matter, or the ultimate particles of matter, consisting of nothing but form. And Schrödinger stresses form prior to anything that has form. In other words, it is what we have here then is form potential, knowledge, knowing, awareness of something. We have all here relatively meaningless words that approach it. of something that is beyond anything and prior to anything material, but is capable of condensing itself, as it were, thickening it into what we perceive as material, and in turn be able to be reversed in the process, to be unthickened, unthinned into its original, what do you want to call it, spirit state. The word has it's got a bad smell nowadays, but still we have no better one. Now that sounds like a very interesting concept, but isn't it a nice fantasy? Well, here we go again. Here we have the peculiar phenomenology of synchronicity. And now, that's a word Jung coined for what he called the coincidence of material events with psychic dynamics. Now, synchronicity you can evaluate statistically. Here we have come down to hard science. Thank God. Yeah. Name me with the I Ching. Anybody here who is not familiar with the I Ching? Okay, very well now. Tell me please now, you know you toss the coins and they fall randomly, and given information that you look up in the book, and that fits in my experience in 99% accuracy, the question you have asked and the situation that it refers to. Now please tell me, how do the coins know what's in your mind, on what page of the book it is, and what King Wu Bi Wan, or what's his name, had in mind 4,000 years ago when the book was written? And how do those coins receive that information from the gravitational forces and the twist of your hands? Please tell me and you get a Nobel Prize. And the candidate, well, I can't answer it either. But what do we have here? We have the clear phenomenon of a so-called psychic, mental issue, dynamic, translating itself, thickening itself, condensing itself into the behavior of matter. Just as, reversely, in synchronicity, a psychological attitude may precipitate an external event, and as in reverse, a thinning out, as it were, let us say, of arsenic, arouses psychological effects. Process that cuts both ways, empirically demonstrable. That's the point. You can show it. Now, if you want this, by the way, if you meet one of those chaps who tell you this is all pure suggestion and prove it, and when you then go ahead and try to prove it with as it was done in France with enzymes, and he brings in a magician and tells you that hocus pocus, there is a very simple answer I suggest to you. Invite him to do a proving. And invite him to taste Belladonna 200 every 2 hours for 24 hours. He may use a double placebo test if he so chooses, but he will have his answer very quickly. I never understand why it hasn't been done. Of course, those smart Alex may refuse to take Belladonna, but play safe. Now, if I were to sum it up then, you could say we have some unknowable essence, something or else or what, which can manifest the one way or the other. It can manifest in terms of what we can put our hands on. It can manifest as that which we can only interiorly experience. And those manifestations are manifestations of the same, mutually alterable and exchangeable. This Jung has very neatly summed up in the following quote. Here's Jung, now I'm quoting him. Mind and body are presumably a pair of opposites, and as such the expression of a single entity whose essential nature is not knowable, neither from the outward material manifestation nor from inner direct perception. We can only deal with the manifestation, which we receive in different codings, as it were. One this one, the other is that one too. We may then speak of an unknowable living being concerning the nature of which nothing can be said, except that it vaguely expresses the quintessence of life, of existence. Okay, that is the introduction. Now I would like to come from there and deal with the miasms. But any questions now? Leon? Yes, loud, please.
What implications does what you have to say have for the concept of energy cannot be created or destroyed?
Question is, what do you mean with energy? In terms of physics, the fact is certainly established, but energy can be converted. Energy can change from one manifestation to the other, so we are right back to where we are. In other words, energy, then what we consider energy is one particular manifestation of that. Call it what you want. Spirit, God, the all, and it can come to you as hot water or hot air. Anything else? So that point clear so far. All right, now we come into maybe hot water a little bit. I would like to talk about the miasms. You know, the miasms are most controversial, to the non-homeopaths absurd, to the homeopaths, is it controversial and peculiar things. Hahnemann called them, spoke of invisible influences, we would now say form patterns, that are infective. Now, I would remind you, they are as infective as a potency is. I would not care to kiss somebody, for instance, who just has taken a dose of sulfur in his or her mouth. It's infective. And when we confuse covers of bottle tops, we throw the whole stuff out. So we have miasm, potency, effect, infection, synonymous things. But now comes our classification into soric, syphilitic, and psychotic. And we deal with, for instance, we postulate a syphilitic miasm where there is clear evidence there has never been any syphilis anywhere. You can say maybe the great-great-grandfather who lived in the time of, Philip II of Spain may have caught syphilis. Well, who can gainsay that? But it is pulled by the hair. Sometimes it is there, sometimes it is not. It's just as often not there as it is there. The same with gonorrhea. I had a clinical teacher in Vienna who said a little bit of a gonorrhea everybody has. And another one who said anybody with a mustache like this has had syphilis. But this is a rather loose way of diagnosing. So, on the other hand, empirically, it is valid because the group that includes Syphilinum does include a certain group of remedies that are in accord with it. And the same with Thuium and Medorinum, for instance. The point is, if we are not putting the cart before the horse, might it be not that the miasm is caused by syphilis or gonorrhea, but might it be that the miasmatic condition predisposes to syphilis and gonorrhea? Similarly, of course, the derivation of psora from the itch is rather weird for us nowadays. The first proposition I have is perhaps it might be better not to speak of syphilitic and psychotic and psoric in the sense of believing in that, but of a group of constitutional states that belong, broadly speaking, to the Mercury sphere, another that belongs to the Thuya sphere, and a third one, if it's a third, that is under the influence of sulfur and related remedies. There we start, there we are on solid, pragmatic and empirical grounds. But now, what are these states really? And now I would like to start with psora. Psora was considered by Kant the expression of the fall of man. Psora is, if for the Swedenborgian, the illness of sin. I believe this to be true. I'll explain to you what I mean. We have to deal here with the basic phenomenon, first, of what does it mean, or how does it operate, to be born a human being. What is it? It is the coming into visibility of a body, of that essence that we previously discussed when we spoke of the thinning in and thinning out. This is a thickening in of a human essence, of a human spirit, of a human being that pre-existed, it's one way or the other, prior to its embodiment. In other words, we deal with the phenomenon of incarnation, of becoming flesh. Am I speaking now of religion? I'm speaking of psychological experience, to wit. I once was working with a particular person, and there was some serious problem of his childhood. It was a lawyer, it was actually a very hard-boiled lawyer. And we decided it might be helpful to recover some of those very early childhood experiences that are not remembered. The childhood regressive techniques are routine techniques now by transinduction. So I suggested, gave him the suggestion to go back. He thought it must have been when he was 2 or 3 years of age. So, but usually I prefer to play dumb and not nail it down, so I suggested that he go back to where the particular issue arose. And he proceeded to describe that a conversation with his sister that went about something like it's the sister telling him, keep away, keep away, keep away, that's a mess there. And he said, nope, nope, nope. I have business, I must do it. But she's saying, you don't know what you're getting yourself in for. These people are just horrid. You will regret it. He said, yes, I know, but I have to do something there. It went on and on for a while, and it made no sense to me. Because clearly he was speaking, apparently it turned up of his parents. But what about the sister? I'd never heard of that sister. So I asked him, who is that sister? He said, she's dead. Huh? She's dead. And how old are you? I'm not yet conceived. So this was a description of a preconception planning, as it were, where he gets good advice from somebody who has been through the mill already, but chooses to disregard that advice. He came out and he was rather startled and asked me, so what's that? I refused to answer that. I said, it's that whatever you want to make of it. But it is, this is not a unique experience. I have gone through that a number of times. It is quite clear now that our life does not start with birth, and that these so-questioned memories, interestingly enough, carry much more of an emotional impact than the bona fide childhood memories. So merely one of a demonstration that this is really a coming into a body. Interestingly, the British analytical psychologist Fordham calls this process not incarnation but deintegration, namely the loss of an a priori totally integrated psychic entity into various body, mind, emotion drives, and so on. But, you see, the term deintegration already implies that something is lost thereby. What is lost? That very thing that this patient recovered when he went out of the rational day consciousness. Our rational ego day consciousness is a very limited one, a very impoverished and poor. For instance, every self-respecting cat or dog knows when an earthquake is coming. We don't. Any decent rat knows when a ship is sinking. We don't. And so on and so forth. We speak of an altered state of consciousness, but this altered state of consciousness is much wider, includes the whole range of animal, plants, and minerals that we have no connection to. Another example of that. One of my sons was on the West Coast, and they had an old Volkswagen bus, and drove home, and somewhere in the Middle West it conked out. He was that in a hippie state, and money was not something that he prided himself of. So all he could do he went and talked to his boss and said, please bring me home, please bring me home. And then fiddled around, and the Volkswagen started again and drove home. He came down our driveway in front of the garage, and that finished. The bus came out, and nothing could bring the bus back to life. Now what had happened? The bus had heard and had responded, and that's not funny. I know a similar incident where a cleaning lady talked to the washing machine. Said, now please, the washing machine responded. You know how your automobile responds to you, not only your cats and dogs, but also things. So lifeless, quote, lifeless things are condensed awarenesses. But we, when they hear us, but we don't hear them necessarily. In that way, they are smarter than we are. So this is the falling then, the falling into a dimension of what the East calls Maya, which is illusion, delusion. But this Maya illusion is our reality. Maya means reality also, and it is our reality, worse luck. Which is dominated by split opposites. Black, white, right, wrong, good, bad, ill, healthy, body, mind, and so on and so on. Our delusion. Therefore, ye shall be like gods, knowing good and evil. The fall of man. And this is Sora. The falling out of the transcendental integrated unity, however, as a chosen, willed experience for the sake of individuation, of structuring, of working with those opposites, and bringing them into an reintegrated state, seemingly. Namely, of creating a life drama. And no drama can operate without opposites. If Hamlet and his stepfather love each other from the very beginning and to the end, you have no play. If you are invited to that, are bored, you go home and ask for your money back. And for the sake of creating meaning, namely making sense of all that mess that we find ourselves in. And looking for meaning is the headline of Sulfur. Sulfur is not just the rugged philosopher. Sulfur is a seeker after the spirit, fundamentally. Sulfur pathology is either a person who is too dense for his own good or too running after too many spirits. But the essence is meaning. And of course, as you see, Sulfur is bipolar like all miasms. Then what is the fall of man, Sulfur, Soric miasm? It is nothing more and nothing less than the propensity to become ill, as an indispensable aspect, to become sick, as an indispensable aspect of existence. Have you ever met a totally well person? It's an abstract invention. And interesting, this abstract invention is the standard of modern medicine. The Swiss psychiatrist Ziegler created the term morbism, which is a very good term, which is not a synonym for sorrow. The problem of integrating all these various split apart energies of life that are part of the original integrated total. A most beautiful characterization of that, I put it as a heading of one of the chapters in the Alchemy of Healing, I would like to quote to you again by Fritsche. Quote, "Throughout the whole of life, the fullness of what constitutes one's integral self must ever and again be put into bounds, tempered and ordered anew. Constantly the powerful potentials of this fullness are wont to break out into arbitrary self-arrogation of separate power, instead of remaining within the spirit." You see, the separation tendency is simply part of being human. These separative urges are necessary, however, lest man, the microcosm, become inert, and in order to make him guard and outgrow the anarchic drives of his formative forces. Yet that makes him ill. Illness is necessary, is fundamentally morbus sacer, sacred illness, is humanness. In other words, what we bring with ourselves always tends to deintegrate, always tends to up and down, now moving into focus, another one moving into focus. This is the law of change, without which there is no humanness in human development. But this change is always opposed by inertia, which is, again, an integral part of materialization. So the new wave always bumps against the old pattern, and there is conflict. And it hurts, pain. I just got the matter settled, now you come with those new headaches. Who hasn't been through that? And when we choose then to put those new headaches under the rug, they begin to smell there, and we get physical symptoms. More is 4. So, what is then this morbism, the sora? As I said, either the sulfur state is too much fire or too much stagnation. It means that any a priori given constitution always includes some forms of morbidity. For instance, Thiele points an attention that in primitive sculptures, the great ancestors practically always show some deformation, either warts or bony excrescences or any part of their anatomy deformed in their totem representations. In other words, it's the spirit of the tribe already is conceived in terms of a particular pathology. In other words, it includes some form of morbidity that eventually causes death, believe it or not. We are suspended from the moment of birth between the hopeful health and the trip towards death. There is this beautiful, I think it's a Grimm fairy tale, of the man who once caught death up by some magic spell and refused to let him go unless he agreed, since sometimes he has to meet him, that he would give him adequate warning. So he lived a very nice life, and some day suddenly death stood there and said, come now. He said, hey, no, nothing doing. You broke your promise. You didn't give me any advance notice. And death said, didn't I? I gave you plenty of advance notice. Weren't you ill then and then? Didn't you have this pain then and then? Didn't you suffer these difficulties then? What else do you want? He lost, he had to go. So these are really always reminders that there we go. No life can be free of that. Similarly, likewise, psychologically speaking, everybody has their psychological pathology. Everybody has, believe me or not, a crazy corner. Even therapists. And children of therapists, foremost. In fact, it has been an unspoken custom at the Jung Institute in New York that anybody who is too healthy, seemingly, not in touch with his pathology, is not suitable to be a therapist, would be rejected. Of course, somebody who is totally in it isn't suitable either. So you have sometimes a very thin line. But it is always there. It is what Jung calls a shadow. Namely, that part of ourselves which we prefer not to look at, and which does not fit well with our idealized self-image. This is incidentally why working with dreams is so difficult, with one's own dreams, because the dreams nearly always point to the shadow area, to our blind spot. And the blind spot is a blind spot because it's blind. Or as Jung once said, the trouble with the unconscious is that it's unconscious. So we are all, again, the idea of a normal person, in this sense, is absurd. One of my teachers said, yes, the only normal people, really normal people, are the Nazis, because they are beasts. And there's something to that in this quotation mark. However, these neurotic or psychotic islands, at the same time, are our spur to creativity and always compensate our one-sidedness. Again, you have your position. This is the answer to the so often discussed question, what about the relation between genius and insanity? Now, it doesn't mean that a genius has to be insane. If he's insane, he won't be a genius. But he certainly has a peculiar corner somewhere. Otherwise, he would simply be complacent and nothing would happen. Now, when those one-sided shadow areas fall into matter, namely when they are totally out of the psychic reach, again we have body pathology. Again, the fall into matter. They manifest materially. For instance, resentment and hate may compensate too righteous, duty-bound, and justice-identified conscious attitude. I need not remind you of the hate and destructive wars that were unfolded historically in the name of love for the soul, of how the Inquisition would save your soul in Christian love by burning you at the stake, just to keep you from the hands of the devil. How much cruelty, for instance, is committed in the name of love and justice. Allergies as manifestations of being oversensitive to one's way of life, for instance. Occupational allergies, when an occupation is hated. Or hypertension, cardiac pathology, infarction, as the unrealized expression of unrealized resentful aggression and competition. Or typically a hunchback or bent spine is the expression of carrying guilt. Just some arbitrary examples, really. So we can say being needs illness. It needs disturbances from time to time in order to wake up, and uses for that person, for that purpose, any available material, bacteria, viruses, air pollution, partners, husbands, wives, bosses, employees, chemicals, cars, pedestrians, policemen, or whatever, pollen. In other words, the world is as clean or harmonious as our thoric need allows it. And it varies widely. On the other hand, this morbism, the illness, often prevents an acting out. For instance, if I get a migraine, instead of hitting my wife. So it has also its useful function, if you want to. So these are all not deviations from norm, but spurs to growth and balancing factors that express the particular way an individual happens to be related to this life and to his individuality. It is one's unique way of being. But as an aside, they are not delusions and illness, as Sankaran puts it. He has something, but he hasn't quite it. Rather, the delusions, which are important guides for a remedy, express the underlying dynamic of the illness. The illness is real, and the delusion shows the psychic tendency behind it. There are the images for the underlying shadow dynamic. For instance, delusion, he is a devil. Well, it does belong to anacardium, because anacardium type people psychologically are devils, psychologically. Or he must get home, must get away, must get home. for bryonia. It's valid. Because bryonia is clinging. In bryonia, people always hold on, have to be there, whatever the there may be. So the images here express the underlying psychic reality, the imaginal reality, which our rational thinking cannot grasp otherwise. Because, as I should have mentioned before, this pre-Sauric level, that prior to the fall, as it were, awareness, is a formal awareness, an image awareness, not of concepts, but of images. That is why children learn to orient themselves imaginally at first, and need to be fed images. That is why we can conceive of our remedy reality only in images, not otherwise. Remedy pictures. That's why dreams speak images and not concepts. Because this is the aboriginal language of being, and also life around us has forms. It doesn't fill with inscriptions of do this and do that. Let us take any remedy now. Since we deal with remedies, let's take Ferrum Phos, or belladonna, as good as any. What is this? You have a potency. That potency is a spirit in a bottle. Yeah? We have gone over that. Now, when you let that spirit loose, for instance, you take that bottle and you want to really be nasty and hold it under the nose of your partner. You have now really show it to him or her, and he will get, he may start to prove belladonna. So what has happened here? That spirit out of the bottle has taken hold of that person if he, she happen to be sensitive to it. Not all provers respond in the same way, by smelling already. So given a particular susceptibility, that spirit has gotten hold, has infected. Now instead of belladonna, you take influenzine. And you do the same thing, and the same thing happens. Here you have the model of infection, namely what I would call the demon, the genius. We speak of the genius epidemicus, and say, for instance, the genius epidemicus this time is Ferrum Phos. So the Ferrum Phos spirit is loose now, has become potentized, activated, more activated, and now runs wild. You have an epidemic, which, just like the proving, will affect you only to the degree of your susceptibility. The famous experiment of Pettenkofer, the German chemist, I think, who thought this whole talk about infection was just Bochum. He particularly wanted to disprove Koch, and neutralized his stomach acid with alkali, and then swallowed a whole culture of live cholera bacilli, and remained perfectly untouched. So he had proved it, but he had proven nothing. He had only proven that he wasn't susceptible to it. So therefore, the epidemics do respond, are a combination, a family of demons, if you want to, namely of impulses. It has gone running amok, corresponding to what we know in a different coding as our substance spirits. Did that answer your question? Or, no, do you have any objection to it?
What happens in something like the Black Plague? What happened in something like the Black Plague?
Exactly that. For instance, take those great, the ravaging epidemics, always started at a time of terrific psychic upheavals. The Black, I think, yes, one of the Black Plague followed the 30 Years' War. The deadly influenza epidemic followed the First World War, as an example. In other words, these are times where demons, psychic demons are unleashed, and where the aftershock then hits home. I really mean it when I say they are demons. The point is this: now I say psychic, this is, I don't know what I'm talking about. It's one of those entities is sort of started up and goes through repeated reactivations. It is analogous to the process of potentizing. Another energetic impulse till it really, from a 30, unfolds the energy of a 1 million, and then it cuts through.
Would you say that this applies to AIDS?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. It applies to syphilis too. Because you see, there's a history of illnesses. You can correlate new illnesses to certain cultural epochs. For instance, I have personally no experience with AIDS cases, but I've been told, for instance, that one very often indicated remedy is natriumur. AIDS is a psychotic manifestation, I believe, and has to do with, shall we say, I'll come to that in psychosis, shall we say, loused up eros principle. It is, you might say, the revenge of the goddess. But also syphilis, a renaissance. The Spaniards called it the French disease, the French called it the Spanish disease. And the white called it the Indian disease, and the Indians called it the white man's disease. It's same old Lyme disease. I have, for instance, I have once checked the map in Europe. They have, in the pharmacies, at that time they had regional maps of Lyme infestation. And they're all around the settlements. The big cities, the smaller cities, and the villages. Outside the untouched wild area, no Lyme disease. What is it? It is a response of nature to filth, to human intrusion, a defense against it.
Say on the individual level, illness is always an opportunity to integrate something that's been split off. So too then with epidemics, is it an opportunity at a social level to integrate something that's been split off?
Illness is an opportunity at an individual level to integrate something that's split off, is that?
Well, that's,
yes, not necessarily that split off.
The individual and the life drama of the individual, so too cultures and societies have a life drama. And I'm asking whether the epidemic is an aspect of that life drama of a culture, of a society, to integrate something that's split off, or is it in the cultural shadow?
So is an epidemic an aspect of our society as a whole, like an individual having a particular illness? An epidemic is like an illness of the society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Something we have to integrate.
Absolutely, yes. Illness, you mean it's a collective illness. Absolutely. And always poses a demand, in a way. Look at this issue. For instance, the influenza after the World War, look at that hate. It is still in the air. Here, with AIDS, I believe, look at this abuse of emotions, of feeling. or the lime. Simply look at that filth, that ecological destruction that is being spread, and so on. It is always, illness is always, I pay attention to whatever.
Saying, is physical pathology always to do with, always an aspect of the shadow?
It always means that something new wants to be seen or heard and experienced. Something different, it is that. Whether this, we will come to that later, on what level is another story. Remember the two cases that I started with. The one had to be integrated on the sulfur level, the other on the music level. But they are equivalent. I can say now, whatever cannot yet be assimilated on the consciousness level will have to be experienced and suffered in the body. And that applies to everybody of us, because nobody is there of being able to metabolize everything. We are still rather primitive creatures.
Go ahead.
I have a problem of knowing why there are so many different individual essences and remedies, like over 3,000, if in fact we came from one spirit that is a unifying spirit, and why there are three miasms and three, there's only one sulfur descension into the earth, that the sulfur should clear everything.
So basically, why do we need 3,000 remedy pictures or essences when there is only sort of one fundamental disease, etc.? Yeah.
Or one spirit.
One spirit.
Why are these individual entities? I don't. You began by saying there are individual entities that coalesce, but Buddhism says there's no individual entities at all.
Why aren't you Mr. Clinton? Why isn't he Mr. Nixon? Why aren't they all alike? I mean, I cannot answer why, because I wasn't there when the thing was planned. But I can only say that's the way it is. The one has chosen to manifest in the million different individual forms. This is individualization. No two lives are alike.
You can't treat the one.
What was the last?
He's still asking what you can't just treat with one remedy. Is that what you meant?
The one.
The one spirit.
One spirit.
I didn't get it.
I think he's still sort of, you're returning to your original question in a way, really.
No, how would, suppose you have a personal problem and you go to a counselor who says to you, well, you just do that and that. That works for everybody. It ought to work for you too. Get married. That will fix it. How's about it? Why? I'll give you back your question now. What's wrong? It has worked for other people.
Right. Yeah. Why not?
I agree with you.
Perhaps you'll let us know. Let's do follow-up.
Okay.
It seems like in the beginning it might have, but I think that as time has gone on, we just create more and more problems that need more and more lessons, that need more and more remedies. We look around, we're constantly making more difficulties that need solving. It goes way beyond that now. It seems much more demonic if we want to...
Well, we are getting more complicated. This is our development. That's the point that Teilhard de Chardin made. Life moves to greater and greater differentiation. Whether once it was as simple as that, I don't know, but I doubt it.
There was always the potential.
That's good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, better.
Okay. My question was, we have this concept that human beings need to experience illness as enough of a disturbance to their equilibrium in order to become more well. My question is, what about the concept that human beings can experience an ecstatic disturbance?
Ecstatic?
Ecstatic
Yes.
disturbance as a stimulus to seek more development and more wellness. And can we not look at how to use homeopathic remedies to stabilize the ecstatic experiences as opposed, or in addition to working with the illness experiences?
Let me see if I got you. What then is your question? What about the homeopathic tendency to stabilize it? No, I don't. What is the gist of your question, really?
It's a twofold question. One is, can we start thinking about how to use remedies in a different way, in a different thought pattern, and what's your feeling about using remedies to stabilize a well to a more well place, not an ill to a well place?
I don't see any difference here. Let me start from the beginning. You know, at the temple of Apollo in Delphi, there were two inscriptions. Only one is known, generally. The one was well-known, know thyself. But there was the other, it was namely nothing in excess. And too much of a good thing. The Greek called it hubris. We call it Sora. Sora is hubris. And it is illness. So, but what is excess is individually different again. So for a certain person, an ecstatic experience may be the most powerful, moving, and creative experience of his life. For another one, it may be the opening to the madhouse. Depending upon whether he has the means of holding and integrating it. Now, what the remedy does, I will come to that later in detail, it gives it supplies the, shall we say it, biological frame with the capacity to allow the unfolding of the spirit. It means, you could say, it stabilizes. So that therefrom the next step, namely of confronting the spirit, can be taken. If when the frame is too weak and breaks, then your ladder gives way, and instead of going up, you go down. Another thing, of course, is that you didn't ask that, but for instance, that initiation just by drugs is like taking a helicopter ride up to Mount Everest and believing I was there, but then you're down again now, possibly with an issue of altitude illness or something. So it can give you a glimpse, but it isn't it. Yeah?
If we're all different individuals, why is it that we can give the same remedy to different people?
Didn't hear a word.
Why don't we need a different remedy for every different personal experience?
Why do we need a different remedy for every person? Why don't we need a different remedy for every different personal experience that we have?
Often you do. Often, frequently you do. You're on a remedy for a while and it has...
But more, why don't we need 200 million remedies?
Why don't we use 200 million?
Why don't we have 200 million remedies for all of the kind of experience that one particular person can?
But we do. We're only too dumb to know it yet.
Each person, not each.
We have... What is proven is a fraction only of what is potentially a necessary remedy, probably. Every existing substance is a potential remedy. And only we are too dense to as yet to an experience to avail ourselves of it. After all, it's no secret that the best prescribing sometimes is unavailing, simply because the remedy is not available.
A veterinarian, we deal with animals and the diseases, and I have a question for Dr. Whitman about how he feels that disease in this it pertains to animals, given that we look at ourselves and see that disease is a way that we learn as part of our psyche. How does this apply to animals? Does that disease, is it a way for the two-legged person to learn through the disease of the animal, or how does it apply?
It is my impression that the near in the animal levels, the nearer you come to the human, the more illness you have. I do believe, here need to be corrected, but wild animals rarely have illnesses. Is that correct?
But they can. I've seen cancer.
But the nearer you come to the human, and particularly the domestic animals, they are the sickest.
Correct.
And animals in general reflect, particularly you see that with domestic animals, you look at somebody's dogs and cats, and you know the person. They reflect usually the shadow side of the person. So I do believe that the degree of domestication, namely the degree of humanization, proportionately also reflects back then the human sorry condition in degrees. I never heard of a disease of worms, for instance. Or I don't know, do you ever had that snakes got sick? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wild snakes?
Yeah,
rather than be the victims of some ravage, of some general destructive process.
I do a lot of work with wild animals, rehabs of wild animals, and they do get sick. But the thing is, in the wild, if you get sick, you don't last very long. But snakes get worms, snakes get tuberculosis.
Mm-hmm. Totally in the wild?
Well, by the time
without human presence.
They get worms in the wild, yeah, for sure.
Oh, worms, that's something else.
But
there you have...
I can't tell you, because by the time we've gotten them, they've gone through being with people.
You see, there is a general destructive tendency throughout the whole of nature. We are the best in that sense, but we are not the only ones. So I think one has to differentiate between destruction by an outside agent and something that develops intrinsically. In this sense, I would only speak of illness in the latter.
Well, the wild birds certainly have epidemics amongst them, and the wild mammals have epidemics amongst them also. But at this point, man is all over, so it's a chicken or an egg, which came first.
Beyond that, I cannot answer it. I don't know then. Needs to be found out. But I would think it is a reflection somehow, a reverberation of the human factor, but particularly, obviously, in domestic animals.
They don't get the amount of chronic illness, though, that we see in the domestic.
Yeah, that's another point.
That's the difference. The epidemics, they're acute manifestations. They aren't the chronicities.
But dogs and cats have chronic illnesses.
The domestic animals, too.
There's something over there.
Dr. Whitmont, I guess we hear a lot about consciousness these days, and about how man as a species and how we're evolving to a higher level of consciousness. One of the things that bothers me about consciousness is that we humans are rather arrogant, and we assume that no other species has consciousness in the way that we have consciousness, where my intuition tells me that it's maybe a hierarchy of consciousness and that we're on the top, but to simply write off the rest of the population of the planet as being just reflex-driven or instinct-driven bothers me in some sort of a way because of the arrogant aspect of it. And also, if we're all on a hierarchy of consciousness, why do we humans have to assume that everything in the world is to serve us and to serve our consciousness?
I mentioned the consciousness of the washing machine and of the Volkswagen bus. Only for, some more will be said about it later. In short, I do believe that some sort of consciousness is a universal element because we live in a life-conscious cosmos. But for practical purposes, I suggest, as I do in the book, to make a difference between consciousness and awareness, purely arbitrary, and reserving the word consciousness for what we call the human level, ego consciousness, because there are differences. So just for the sake of word conclusion, but otherwise I fully agree. It's not, yes, arrogance, but also stupidity, the notion that this is part and parcel of the Cartesian doctrine that ended up in positivism then, but totally unrealistic and nonsensical. So I don't even respect it as much as you do. Yeah. Okay, then let's go on. Now to sum up then, this Sora then being simply, or more bism, the given basic human situation, or I might almost say the condition of humanness, it means that chronic problems do not go away, ever, not even under psychotherapy, believe it or not, nor under homeopathy. But they point always towards a goal, towards where you need to go. Not that you ever reach the goal. The individuation goal is like the pole star. It sets the direction. But any sailor who expects to reach the pole star is crazy. So my problems give us a direction, and when we have settled with one, we are being rewarded for getting the next one. And as you graduate from kindergarten, you go to grade school and its problems, and then to college, they're getting more and more difficult. Because you are now entitled, you have the right to deal with more difficult issues. What can be done? Then the question is, what is healing? The help is to support the ability to deal with them, to hold them in check so that they don't overwhelm you, and to transform them into a means of growth and of widening of consciousness. Because awareness is there already. Your stomach has awareness and your spleen has awareness. And in my experience, this holds true to the moment of death. I can concretely recall 2 instances where I worked with people to the day of their death. And what the unconscious then presented usually was a summing up and that was done, that was not done, this is still to be dealt with. Totally irrespective, as though it was too dumb to realize that this person was going to die. I mean, I mentioned in the alchemy book 2 of those cases in different places. The one was of that man who brought me in the morning a dream where he sat in a camp bed vis-a-vis his brother, and a young puppy tried to jump in and he threw it out. Then he heard the voice of the great-grandmother. It is 10 minutes to 4. Now his brother was carrying of his shadow problem. He was a very conservative, hard, limited, and dogmatic person. And sitting in the camp bed went for him the sort of the evening palaver to review the day. So he is put here face to face with his life problem. The young puppy, the new life, which he throws out, that cannot, will not deal with now. And the voice of 10 minutes to 4, this was the most interesting thing. 4 o'clock was coffee break. So they asked him, what's coffee break? Well, you take off and take a break, and then you go back to work. 10 minutes to 4. That same evening he died of a heart attack, unexpectedly. So ostensibly it doesn't end there either. I would say what you leave at your desk tonight, you find there tomorrow morning. That is called karma, in the simplest definition. So then there is no such thing as enforceable normalcy. There is only, that would be individually repressive, there's only one particular way of managing to deal with one's misery or joy, whatever. So in this sense, and life is a constant conflict tension. Out there. Internal, external, which is you find already in the human spiritual tradition, namely the fall, brings with it suffering, shame, and sin in terms of the conservative religious tradition. But essentially what it amounts to is that the dramatic tension and need for dramatic resolution of a pattern, of a form, in other words, the creation and shaping of ever new form, is the quantum pulse of life. Once that stops, life stops. When we find real peace, seemingly it's the end. Or in a more positive way, when we have done our current assignment, we are free to go for a while to pick up the next puzzle. Now, this applies, a little deviation, or shall we say, that is important for the eternal problem with one's parents. Why is it that the parents, and particularly the mother, as you know, is always in the wrong? The regression that I described to you of the lawyer before, in a way, answers that. Seemingly, one's parents are chosen in order to have something wrong. Because you cannot have a dramatic form without a challenge. So I would go as far as saying that we elect our parents in order to have our troubles with them, and in order to blame them, and if we are dumb enough to continue to blame them. But apparently, parents and children must always represent a generational gap and a generational conflict. Now I will have a deviation. This can be shown astrologically, namely by the fact that children always, new children share some aspects of parents and grandparents. I just had the most dramatic demonstrations of that myself. I had a new grandson coming into life about 2 weeks ago, and his major chart aspects are almost identical with mine. It was quite an experience. Now, the interesting point is that, as you see, the astrological configuration of the chart connect or correspond with genetic predispositions. These genetic predispositions are, however, set at conception or shortly after conception. The corresponding astrological constellation occur 9 months later. So you have the moment of birth is then selected according to predisposition. In this case, for instance, the labor started, slowed down, didn't move. They called me, I checked it out and asked him to give the mother a dose of causticum. Causticum set it going, and within 2 hours or something the birth occurred. at Capricorn rising 2 degrees. I have Capricorn rising a half degree, almost degree exact. So the slowing down was almost in order to await and to fit in with that degree of Capricorn. I recall, for instance, many years ago when I was rather skeptical about astrology, I had a patient who I had worked who was in a serious marriage crisis. She was married to a musician. She was a rather domineering type. And we agreed when she would give birth, she would telephone to me the birth time immediately, and I would turn it over to an astrologer without knowing anything. And within a day I got it back. What was, as far as I remember, a musically gifted child, very strong under the influence of a domineering mother, problems in their home, chances of a breakup of their home within 1 year. There was a proto-transit 1 degree due. Even that event promptly happened. In other words, what I'm saying, here you have in the prefigurations the basic patterns that the later psychotherapists will reduce to the influence of the parents. But it's already there to begin with. So of course you have to have parents that will fit. Therefore, Jung's statement, one's aphoristic statement, once saying, God is everything that opposes the ego. Namely that which always throws the conflict, the difficulties in our way. Okay, now let's come to the special forms of Sora. I would see it that way. Namely primarily psychosis and syphilis, or Thuya and Mercury. Possibly also, I do not know whether one should use the tubercular and carcinomatous condition as separate or as subgroups. That is a matter of arbitrariness, I believe. Now let's go back to basics here. There are 3 fundamental issues we have to deal with in life. They are represented by the big 3 of psychotherapy, Freud, Jung, and Adler. Namely eros, love and relationship, power, Adler, and meaning, Jung. Meaningfulness. For instance, Frankl has observed, when he was in the concentration camp, that those people survived who could find meaning in the experience, regardless of their vital strength. Those for whom the experience was totally meaningless went under. So meaning is a life factor and belongs generally towards the later part. Hence it is understandable that each of these could create what they thought a total psychological system of their own. But of course in actual life we need all 3 of them. Now, what is eros? Eros is fundamentally the vitalizing power of human affinity, of human interaction. Its pathological extreme demonstration is what has been called hospitalism. Namely, the babies that were raised in the hospital or foundling homes under perfectly hygienic condition, proper nutrition and everything, and sterile conditions, indeed sterile conditions, without human touch, died, couldn't survive. Without the sense of human touch, of human fondling, of experiencing warmth and human nearness on the bodily level, life is refused. They come in and say and feel, if it's that way, forget it, I go back. That's about. If it is less severe, so that survival is possible, there is serious damage, often schizophrenic conditions, or serious physical pathology, marasmus, for instance. So here we have the pathology of bereftness, of the sense of abandonment, bereftness, and often in the more affirmative form of violation, which is the active form of this. Now, how I got to this is those three states, Thora, psychosis, and syphilis, are represented, as I said to you, I mentioned before, by sulfur, mercury, and thuya primarily. But in alchemy, it is sulfur, mercury, and sal. Now look at the pathology of natrium mur. The alchemical salt is not just table salt, but the salt principle, namely whatever has to do with affirming, with materialization. So the sal activity belongs to the first phase of incarnation, and when that it interfered is if we have the experience of bereftness, which is classically expressed in natrium mur. Natrium mur is loss of love pathology. You know that. Or we have gloom, the typical gloom of natrium mur, or hysterical and over-emotional tendencies. So the idea is then that this first phase, eros pathology, equals psychosis. S-I-S-Y-K-O-S. Now look at the psychotic remedies. Thuya, sense of worthlessness, leading, having to please, hiding one's genuine self, sense of being made of glass, of being brittle, of not being there really, feelings of guilt, self-rejection, delusion of being divided, have somebody else in bed, not being oneself, being controlled, psychism, the whole pattern of abandonment, of not being sustained, or shall we say, in simplest form, mild hospitalism. This is the classical psychosis. Now, natrium mur, I don't need to describe to you any further. This argentum nitricum, in the same area, the same sense of not being oneself, having not one's own centers, but this time extroverted, compensated by over external activity, sort of running from one place to the other. Also the typical fear of sense of forsakenness, fear of being alone, feeling repudiated, feeling that he does everything wrong, cannot succeed ever, fear of putting himself on the line. For the psychologist, the typical puer aeternus, the puer aeternus attitude, the youth who never can be a person. And argentum nitricum, natrium mur are complementary medicines. And natrium mur and thuya are. Thyroid, which is a great one in allergic states, in the psychotic states. This fear-driven anxiety and vasomotor lability. Thyroidea, thyroid potency. And of course, medorinum, passions that run away with you. In all these cases, you have, in other words, the lack of a really firm, reliable inner center from which to be there and risk to be oneself. The landmark, psychologically, of the, I would say, love and vital support deprivation. And I believe in keeping that in mind is one of the big problems. It will be easier to see why and how certain remedies do belong into that sal thuya group. Now the so-called syphilis. Here we have the problem of the adult, namely of power and ego, selfless. It is interesting that syphilis became the really rampant condition, as I said, at the time of a Renaissance, when the modern, with consciousness that we are now saddled with, was born. I personally have had for many, many years a problem with understanding Mercury. Then I had the brilliant idea. I asked David to send me a computerized listing of all the mentals, all the verses of Mercury, and sat with those. And this was a revelation. I'll give you now the extract of the Mercury personality as it came to me. Foremost is arrogance, the old term superbia, authority problems, rebellion against authority, or claiming authority, destructiveness, hate, disregard of life. And mind you, this goes through the body pathology of Mercury too. Extremist form, even to criminality, paranoia, persecution ideas, drive for money, restlessness, squandering heroism, and fear of death, tedium, an urge to accomplish things, proud, quarrelsome, impaired understanding, greedy and addicted, discontented, intellectual and intellectual breakdown, no harmony. What is this? Don't you see the face of modern man here? This is practically the collective characterization of our present state of mind. And what is this again psychologically? It is I. Nothing but suits me is valid. Disregard of life. Look at Bosnia. Look at our planet. I rather have a washing machine and a nice bath, even if I have to lay waste the woodlands. What does Mercury do physiologically? What is Mercury? Hermes, the god. Hermes is the mediator between two worlds. You bring out messages from one to the other, the safe guardian of traveling and change. In other words, Hermes is the great integrator. The Mercury pathology, then the syphilitic pathology is called, is disintegration. This is the face of syphilis also. Therefore, this confusing universality almost of the mercurial symptoms. It covers almost anything, just as syphilis. Of syphilis used to say syphilis can do everything. So does Mercury. But interestingly enough, mostly the orifices, mouth, throat, anus, rectum, the entries of the worlds, as Hermes. The Hermes, the Hermes sculpture stood always at the divisions of roads. So the capacity to hold those various aspects together, those various divergent, conflicting aspects of life together, psychologically is a function of the ego. To attempt to integrate all the various conflicting tendencies. When that integrative function fails or is overdrawn, when instead of integrating, the ego arrogates, then we get the syphilitic, namely the mercurial disorders. So what are then the mercurial complementary remedies? Foremost, Hepar, this combination of holding in of carcaria and defensive and then running wild. Hepar is considered a criminal and jailbird's remedy. The most dangerous outbreaks, because I want this. Of course, all the festering abscesses. Nitric acid. This on the one side and wanting to have fun and pleasure on the other, and getting nasty when you cannot have fun and pleasure. Again, how modern can you be? Aurum, one of the chief antidotes of mercury, the king's remedy. Aurum pathology is the one who feels, rightly or wrongly, he has to carry the loads of the world. If I am not there, then everything goes to pieces. Therefore, I'm responsible for everything. And taking on too much, of course, you go down. Aurum are most responsible, up to over-responsible people who see only, in this beautiful symptom, the lower side of things, an optical and the psychological symptom. Lower half of things only are seen. And of course, syphilinum, namely a nihilistic destructiveness, lack of trust in everybody in life, hence fear and anxiety, and always a fear of being overpowered as guiding symptoms. Also, the interesting thing, of course, is in all those remedies, the aggravation at night. What does that say? It means the nightly aggravation. While the ego consciousness, the daylight consciousness prevails, the dogs are quiet. They held in leash. But the moment you withdraw it, all the stuff that has been forced down breaks out. So we have the three phases then: mercury, sulfur, and sal, or psychosis, syphilis, and Sora. In the alchemical process, which speaks later, they correspond to colors, namely black, what is called the nigredo, white, the albedo, and the red, what was it, not citrinos, the rubido, yeah. Now, a rubido and sulfur you can see readily. The whiteness in mercury, you only have to look at the quicksilver. Now, the nigredo, however, the blackness, we'll say some more about this afternoon, was considered in alchemy the total involvement of the soul in substance, the non-separation of soul in substance, which somehow dampens and blackens the light capacity of the soul, and therefore can also come in the form of depression. Look at Eros. Who draws, for instance, clearly the line between sex and love? How closely Eros is body involved, biologically, materially involved, from highest joy to deepest grief. In Goethe's Himmel hoch jauchzend zu Tode betrübt, heavenly aspiring and depressed unto death. From the intensest libido, desire, to blackest depression, which I believe is also a feature of Leitrim Muir, the intensity of involvement. When we come to the albedo, to the whitening, this was likened to cleansing, to purification. Purification, what does purification mean? Purification means that a particular element or whatever is becomes focused upon itself and nothing but that. When you speak of pure copper, for instance, we mean copper without any admixture. So purification means oneness of purpose, focusing, concentration. It does not have to do with absence of sex, as the Church has made it. But there were means of purification, namely of focusing, of concentrating one's mind upon the focus. Certainly this requires an ego effort. It belongs to the ego phase. And it requires practice. For instance, if you have read Zen in the Art of Archery, for instance, it's endless practicing, namely ego focusing, will, until you come to the point where you can let go. So again, see how it fits with the syphilitic miasm. In other words, for this purification was ascesis, which also has the same meaning, namely exercise and practice. The withholding of sexuality is incidental. It is an aspect here for some people of focusing, namely allowing all energy to go only into this one particular channel and no other. But another form of the ascesis and of the purification you find in the tantric forms, for instance, of the Hindu practice, where sexuality was used for precisely that purpose, as a meditational exercise. But all this is this so-called purification phase, we'll come back to this later, then is the setting apart of a center of personalized awareness which can separate itself from the total psyche and thereby become a witness, a step to the development of consciousness. And of course, I said of the rubido then, when this is achieved, then it may burn now. Then the spirit is set free and may even annihilate itself. In the beautiful form of this Goethe poem with, I don't know, tell it no one but the wise one, for the crowd spurns the desire. I extol through the ages has aspired to death in fire. With the last law, but unless your life contain dying and rebirth, you are but a cloudy guest upon this dark earth. This is sulfur. This is a rubido, the final consummation of the confrontation, of the meeting of the spirit. Of course, our sulfur patients often are stuck somewhere in that attempt, prematurely or inadequately. Now, tuberculin, I would be inclined to see it as a psychotic subgroup, but I'm not sure about it. These are first thoughts. It would be something to consider more. But for me, the tuberculin state is a state, again, where the emotions run away, where the person is here and there and hither and thither, wherever the mood and the feeling draws them. And quite in a world of abstractness. The most impressive study to me was reading Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, which takes place in a tubercular sanitarium. But the title that he chose for it He said, the tuberculin is a magic mountain. I remember a tuberculin patient who dreamed only of elves and hobgoblins and fairy tales, and any attempt to connect this with any reality didn't know what we were talking about. She was an elf herself somehow. And so I see the tuberculin people, some people who have found difficulty to ground themselves in the here and now. Now the carcinosine, it seems to me the exact opposite of that. The carcinosine proving, as which have now, actually depicts the psychological pre-cancerous state. Namely, conditions, people who have come up against the wall, who are feel totally thwarted in their life energies, in their creative capacities, and in their aspirations. You know, usually very strongly motivated people with tremendous vitality, who come to a point or in the life in a cul-de-sac from which they feel at least there is no way out. Then this whole thwarted growth capacity falls into the physical. It cannot be created, structured, organized. It becomes unorganized growth that consumes the organism. It is also typically, a feature is that they cannot lift themselves out, this is all typical, of their ego control. If they cannot make themselves go where they want to, they often lack the capacity of letting go, letting be, and letting the wave take over. This is a Soric factor, because Sora is also always a problem of getting oneself back into Tao, T-A-O. So when this is, when we come this against that, then it's carcinosine, with the tremendous depressiveness, of course, it goes with it. Well, again, pause now. Questions? I gave you something controversial. I hope to hear much controversy.
Simple question. Did you mention that there is now a set of carcinosin provings available?
Can you hear it? Take it long?
Are there carcinosin provings?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
And where would we find those?
Where do we find them?
Well, they're described in books.
When this is British. Vubista has one, but there are more recent ones. There are American provings also.
Not proving. Jonathan Shore has written about it.
Clinical. There's clinical information.
I just scraped together whatever I could put my hands on.
Also myself, and that's what I was wondering if you had any other information. Okay, thank you.
But you know, if you keep this image in mind, they all fit in. In fact, I was startled when I read those provings, when I saw this likeness with what I had as a psychologist seen as a cancer personality. Of course, needless to say, it is not necessarily a remedy for cancer, but certainly for the pre-cancerous state. Question which I anticipate here hasn't been asked: what about children? What about children who need carcinosine, or children who develop cancer? Children are very much involved in the unconscious of their parents. And often the unresolved, unworked through issue with the parent becomes the burden of the child. But also don't forget that the child is not born as a tabula rasa. The child brings its own problem with itself too.
You spoke about the alchemical and remedy basically quaternities, and you only mentioned 3. And I have seen the Jungian quaternities with consciousness, unconsciousness compared to Mercury, soul, and so on. Could you talk about the relationship a little bit between the alchemical Jungian and remedy quaternities, or as just, and why isn't there a 4th that you mentioned? Why isn't there a quaternity?
Now let me say this. This afternoon we'll speak much more about alchemy, but it's a peculiar thing. You see, the 3 and the 4 make 7. And there was once the joke that what Freud did for sex, Jung did for the number 4. You know. So it is not this or the other. There are rhythms in existence that correspond to numbers. But there are more than one rhythm. There's a 3 rhythm, there's a 4 rhythm, there's a 7 rhythm, there's a 12 rhythm, there's a 9 rhythm. And it's always, just as there are many keys in the musical scales, for instance, and they may modulate one into the other. You have to deal what fits into one particular pattern, you see in terms of this pattern. There's no need to force it into another. Or to say, but what about the other? So this one works that way. But for instance, here you have right away, do we have, so we have the Sora, syphilis, psychosis. Okay, I see more Sora as the one, the universal one, which has maybe syphilis, psychosis, tuberculosis, and carcinosis. There you have your 4. Behold. So, which paper do you read? Okay, next chapter, the developmental phases of individuation. The first phase we talked already about, namely the deintegration or incarnation. In other words, the salt phase, rooting in the here and now, that is to culminate in the formation of an I, of an ego. And a fixation there also, with the resulting sense of separateness. I against the world. I am other than the world, I am other than you. Which empirically we know isn't just like that. Take the many instances where I made a call yesterday to a friend, he came to the phone and said, "You are nosy." What's the matter? We are just talking about you. We call it telepathy, but what's that? It's a word. And the separateness also from apparent separateness from the world, from the cosmos, from nature and from others. In other words, our maya of reality, of self and shadow. And then the second part, the call for the reintegration in the movement towards the sulfur phase, towards the rubido, to a burning up, if you want to, of that sense of separateness. Through finding a relation to the other, finding line of commonality with the other there and the other wherever. What we call in analytical psychology the guiding self. Namely that focus of consciousness that is other and superior to the ego consciousness. In other words, the realization of self, of oneself, in the context of a greater encompassing pattern which includes our limited selfness with its fears and limitations. And also then the awareness of what has been called the entelechy, namely the inherent goal-directedness, developmental directedness, that is not ours, not chosen by me, but I bring with me, or if you want to, is imposed upon me as my task. There is this old Jewish legend that before birth the soul is shown everything by the guardian angel, everything of earth and heavens, and all the details of his future life. And then when it is born, the angel puts a kiss of forgetting on the forehead. And now the soul is there on earth and has to recover, rediscover everything it knew before. In other words, it means the fulfilling of a personality goal and discovering the meaning and the point of the individual drama. Now, this requires, however, and this is an important point, a separation from the original unity. If I am to witness or to experience on a new level, on the level of my I-ness, something that is my greater I-ness, I have to be able to confront it. In other words, it requires what we may call a disidentification. Because something that I am identical with, I cannot look at. That's again the trouble with one's own dreams. And only, here's the point, to the extent that this disidentification from my biological and instinctual self is made, is possible, only to that extent I can speak of such a thing as a freedom. Because freedom, lastly, means nothing else to be able to fulfill and to be what one is. But where there is automatism, there is no freedom. You cannot say that a dog is free, for instance. You may show a dog a cake that is full of arsenic, and the dog will, or let's say a piece of meat spiked with arsenic, and the dog will jump and eat it. He has no capacity to be told it is poisonous. Either it instinctually, automatically avoids it, or will be taken in. Now, you know, many people are like that still. Who has it said, the human animal is the one that when something doesn't work, he does it again. So here we are in the realm of the capacity for choices. For choices, for decisions, for election of a way, and for learning. Now, this capacity is interfered with in one way by the psychotic miasm, and in another way by the syphilitic one, or shall we say by the thuya or by the mercury state. If we have the thuya interference, namely an unsatisfactory development on the emotional and drive level, in such a way that consciousness cannot separate itself at all, we have what in psychiatry is called the borderline condition, the borderline states. Or in the extreme form, of course, the overtly psychotic states. For instance, the borderline personality is not able to confront its or his or her own foibles. When confronted with a potential insight, they cannot take it, They cannot relate to it. They may crack under it, or they may simply go out. There is no capacity for self-witnessing. And the typical borderline personality is the one of tremendous amount of childhood deprivation. Hence, no ego witnessing and no ego self-confrontation possible. So this, again, the psychotic pathology, of course, on the basis of psoriatic predisposition, is one of eros deprivation and unable for self-confrontation. It is shattering, oversensitivity of what is felt as destructive criticism. To point out a problem is felt as destructive criticism. The self-awareness capacity is arrested, low self-esteem, or ego fragmentation, or very often, interestingly enough, the multiple personality syndrome. It is typical that our time that has so much childhood abuse, childhood deprivation, owing to our social condition, whatnot, has also this tremendous increase in multiple personality problems. And fundamentally, this is the point, and I'm bringing it up, psychotherapy is very, very limited here in what it can do. But a remedy will be tremendously helpful, because this is on a level that is still below what an attempt by ego consciousness can bring about. So here you have a state where a psychological psychiatric state clamors for a remedy. The next one, the mercurial one, obviously is the one where we have an actual or seemingly ego hypertrophy. We call it narcissism, or the other. Here, the ego is interfered with to look at itself, as it were, to look at its own foibles, and renounce its leading position. The involvement in the drive level is here so as to inflate, to overblow the ego. Examples. Do you remember the many years in the Eisenhower day, Senator McCarthy? Here you had one, an overblown ego. What happened when he was fired? Within 2 years he died of cancer. The Shah of Persia, within 2 or so years after losing his throne, he died of cancer. Here you had an ego that could not set itself aside. And thereby, again, the growth, individuation capacity blocked, growth went into tumor capacity. You have quite often here the pathology of premature retirement also. And also, very often, the pathology of people who have been well and healthy, quote, all their lives. Because all these morbistic things were held under tightest control. When they get sick, they get a cancer. And it completely breaks it off. In other words, as here the intellectual energies come up against this rigid control, congestion occurs and the structure cracks. So we have then, to sum it up, 4 levels, let's say, of development. One, I would say, is one's basic a priori personality structure. Thus must you be. The a priori patterning of the individuality which enters life choosing its parents. Number 2, the conditioning that occurs then to the baby and child, the modification of those patterns, the bending, cracking, breaking, furthering, fertilizing, or whatever of those tendencies, or traumatizing. Number 3, the capacity for ego awareness of those, to confront those facts and deal with them. And 4, coming back to 1, the a priori set life goal, that which an individual is meant to fulfill. Illustration here, one of the stories, one of the Hasidic stories that Martin Buber presents, saying one particular rabbi, I forgot his name, Rabbi Jonathan, let's say, saying, when once I shall stand before the throne of the highest, I will not be asked, why didn't you live like Moses? I will be asked, why did you not live like Jonathan? The life goal, the task. Now, 1 and 2 include, almost by definition, the Sora, the Soric state, the morbism. Everybody brings his own troubles with himself, and as you know, once the childhood adds plenty to it. Whenever somebody tells me he had a wonderful golden childhood, I wonder what's the matter with them. So they are these 2 states of limited awareness and psychosomatic identity, and are not in that state accessible to any willed change. Hence, whatever happened there is of limited accessibility to psychotherapy. With that I mean, it can be confronted, it can be seen, but the damage or the particular rifts and serious traumatic distortions will remain. At best they can be borne, they can be lived with, but it remains. But their imprint upon the biological matter, which ever and again renews what an insight may have loosened, can be remedied. This is again the area where the homeopathic remedy is called for and will do wonders. This is the area of the psychosis, of the various compulsive states, where a life decision has been made, but still the old burden continues to hold you down. The remedy can lift it. We'll see later why. Number 3, the range of ego awareness is clearly the domain of psychotherapy. And what belongs to ego awareness will never be touched by a remedy. An unhappy marriage cannot be fixed by a remedy. The wrong choice of a partner cannot be fixed by a remedy. A wrong life decision cannot be fixed by a remedy. The remedy may touch the emotional state as of yore, it may have led to it, but the decision and the moral decisions already is still up to the individual. Equally the goal, that which that life gravitates to and has to gravitate to, is inaccessible to the remedy. An example here of how that works. There was a patient who was pursued by recurring nightmares of threatened, invaded by criminals. And he was in a fear panic, jittery all over. He got arsenic, calmed down, had now dreams that the criminals still came, but he recognized them as mafia types.